Everyone tells you to think before you act. You took that advice seriously. You think before you speak, before you reply to a text, before you walk into a room, before you make a single decision, no matter how small. And yet, despite all that thinking, despite all that careful, exhausting preparation, nothing feels more certain. Nothing feels more resolved. You replay conversations from 3 years ago, ones that ended fine, just to check if you missed something. You rehearse arguments with people who don't even know you're upset. You mentally plan your exit from situations you're not even in yet. People look at you and say, "You worry too much." But you know it doesn't feel like worry. It feels like intelligence, like preparation, like being the one person responsible enough to actually think things through. Here's the contradiction nobody talks about. The mind that thinks the most is often the mind that rests the least. And that gap, that space between constant thinking and genuine peace, that is exactly what this video is about. You don't just think, you meta-think. You think about what you said, then you think about how it landed, then you think about what the other person thought about what you said, then you start wondering if you're overthinking it, then you think about the fact that you're wondering, and round it goes. This loop doesn't need a trigger. It runs automatically, in the shower, in traffic, in the middle of a conversation, while you're still having it, at 2 a.m. when the entire world has gone quiet, except your mind. Your mind never got the memo. Here's what's frustrating. People describe overthinkers with the wrong words entirely. They say anxious, indecisive, sensitive, too much. But those labels miss what's actually happening underneath. Overthinkers are not people who think badly. They are people whose brains never fully switch off what psychologists call evaluation mode. The brain stays open, scanning, assessing, running quiet background checks on everything. Every word spoken, every silence that lasted a second too long, every facial expression that didn't quite match the tone. Was that okay? Could this go wrong? What did that actually mean? It never really stops. And here is the part that most people, even the overthinkers themselves, never fully understand. This isn't a personality flaw. It isn't weakness dressed up as intelligence. It is a pattern. A deeply wired, carefully learned pattern, one the brain built for a very specific reason. And it started much earlier than you probably think. Overthinking doesn't begin in adulthood. It begins the first time your environment felt unpredictable. Maybe there was conflict at home, maybe it was social rejection, or maybe it was simply never knowing what mood the room would be in when you walked through the door. Your brain adapted. It started thinking ahead to stay safe, rehearsing conversations, replaying events, running simulations so next time you'd be ready. Psychologists call this hypervigilance. The brain learning to constantly scan for threats, not because something is wrong with you, but because your environment once taught you that missing a signal had a cost. This became ruminative coping, using thought itself as emotional regulation. And here's why it's so hard to stop. It worked. Neuroscientist Daniel Levitin found that the brain's planning mode actually releases dopamine. The mind gets quietly rewarded for overthinking, and rewarded behaviors repeat. That's not weakness. That's survival dressed as strategy. There's a network in your brain called the default mode network. It activates when you're not focused on anything external. Most people use it to daydream. Overthinkers use it to rerun simulations. Brain imaging studies show chronic overthinkers have significantly higher DMN activity even during rest. Their brains don't idle, they process. Yale psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema studied this for decades. Her finding was striking. People who overthink don't just feel worse, they also think less effectively. All that effort, all that mental energy, and it actually narrows the brain's ability to find real solutions. The brain, working hardest to solve the problem, becomes less capable of solving it. Overthinking creates the illusion of progress. The mind feels busy, productive. But neuroscience shows it's mostly moving in circles, burning energy without generating clarity. The loop isn't logic. It's a misfiring safety system that doesn't know the danger has passed. Here's where the psychology gets surprising. Researchers at King's College London found a strong correlation between high verbal intelligence and increased rumination. The more sophisticated a person's inner language, the more their mind has to work with, and the harder it works. A separate study in thinking and reasoning found overthinkers score significantly higher on empathy and emotional accuracy. They read people well because they've spent years studying behavior, starting with their own. Psychiatrist Grant Hilary Brenner argues that rumination, in its early stages, is the brain attempting deep problem solving. It only becomes destructive when it loops without resolution. The same mind causing suffering at 2 a.m. is the same mind producing insight, creativity, and emotional intelligence during the day. Overthinking isn't a broken mind. It's a highly active mind without an off switch. Most people only ever see one side of that. Most advice tells overthinkers to stop thinking. Meditation apps, breathing exercises, distraction techniques. They help, but they treat the symptom. The deeper problem is identity. Overthinkers build their self-concept around their thinking. I'm someone who figures things out. I'm careful. I don't make the same mistake twice. When you try to stop, it feels like erasing yourself. Psychologist Rick Hansen calls this self-threatening change. The brain resists because the pattern feels like protection. The real work isn't silencing the mind. It's teaching it that the world is safe enough to rest, that not every silence needs decoding, that not every outcome needs rehearsing. That is not a technique. That is a transformation of who you believe you are. If this video described you, that wasn't accidental. The mind that stayed with this until the end is exactly the mind this video was about. Overthinking is not your enemy. It is a part of you that learned to survive by staying alert. The question was never how to destroy it. The question is how to lead it gently towards rest. You've spent years understanding what makes you anxious, but there's another question, one most people never think to ask, and it might be the most important question about who you actually are. That's what we explore next. And if you made it this far, you already know you need to hear it.